On November 24th, the European Union, that self-professed haven of free speech, passed a non-binding resolution aimed at combating Russian-owned state media, accusing Russia of undermining democratic values and seeking to divide Europe via its media networks. The document specifically calls out RT, despite the fact that less than 0.1% of European TV viewers even watch the network. It's the Cold War 2.0, and this McCarthyist red type scare of fear-mongering against Russia is being used not just to disenfranchise unpopular views, but to muzzle watchdogs and censor alternative media throughout the so-called free world. Now, the same day the EU passed its resolution to counter what it called propaganda warfare, the Washington Post ran a hit piece outing many progressive and alternative watchdog journalism outlets as Russian propaganda tools. According to the report, these outlets, including MintPress, Truthout, and Truthdig, were responsible for handing Donald Trump the presidency by publishing fake news about Hillary Clinton during the campaign. Now, the bulk of the Post report relied on PropOrNot, a mysterious online organization that made its social media debut in August. PropOrNot states that by its standards, Russian propaganda includes any site which criticizes the US, Obama, Hillary Clinton, the EU, Angela Merkel, NATO, Ukraine, Jewish people, US allies, the mainstream media, and Democrats, the center-right, and even the center-left and moderates of all stripes. Now that's broad to say the least, but it boils down to this. If you're a watchdog journalist upholding the First Amendment, defending constitutional rights, and working to revive the Fourth Estate from an expanding war machine and surveillance state, PropOrNot will out you as a minion of Putin. And while some of the 200 websites on PropOrNot's The List do publish stories which are blatantly false, calls to take action against fake news have led some writers to warn about the potential for censorship. Now, here to discuss the consequences for independent media outlets caught up in the fake news frenzy is Shadowproof's managing editor, Kevin Gosztola. And I began by asking him how we, members of the independent media and watchdog journalism world, can combat the real fake news and propaganda spread by the mainstream and establishment media. Check it out.
Well, I believe that it begins with people who have independent organizations investing in original reporting and investigative journalism. And if they prove that they are actually making a meaningful contribution that citizens can benefit from, then it's going to be really easy to tune out this sort of noise, this sort of distraction that these mainstream outlets are creating. And that's very difficult, I think, if you have a shoestring budget to invest in some of these things. So, for example, if you want to send someone to cover the resistance against the Dakota Access Pipeline by indigenous people and others who are allies right now, that's going to take money to send somebody. But I think overall, if you can find some way to get enough funds together to send someone to cover and produce something original on what is happening, then it's going to be difficult for them to accuse you of fake news. And, maybe they're going to accuse you of fake news anyway, and that is a separate issue. But I think that you start to drown out this noise by making meaningful contributions to the journalism that is out there.
Right, and I'm really glad you talked about that, because in this election, we saw Donald Trump referred to as a kind of Manchurian candidate during this election. And it's even been alleged that a sophisticated Russian propaganda campaign helped spur so-called fake news against Hillary Clinton, possibly leading to her loss. How much of this outrage against fake news is founded in McCarthyist Red Scare type of fear-mongering against Russia?
Well, first off, I think it undermines the whole nature of freedom of the press to create a blacklist where you put any sort of organizations on a list and you say, stay away from these outlets. We can have discussions and debates about individual outlets or groupings of outlets and whether you should stay away from them. But when you start to put people on lists, you're actually diminishing speech. You're going up against these outlets. And then you're saying that you potentially have a better idea of what people need to see. And then that opens up a whole nother debate. It opens up a greater debate about whether your outlet actually has the answers when it comes to the news.
Right, and I want you to expand a little bit on that. This leads me to my next question, which is, what are the repercussions of creating such a media blacklist and not only branding independent media publications, but journalists as well as mouthpieces of Russia or enemy governments for criticizing the establishment?
There's probably a little bit of it that is very real legacy of McCarthyism, leftover Cold War nostalgia. But I think some ways this is just basically laziness on the part of people who have positions on editorial boards at these media organizations who maybe are in the boardrooms running these corporate outlets. And that this is an easy way to explain why they have lost complete connection with citizens in this country. I mean, this whole revolt against the establishment media that we saw play out throughout the 2016 election, I think really has many of the leading pundits baffled at how to respond. And what can they do to come down from their ivory tower to figure out what not just the white working class is going through, but people of color. What are the working class that are people of color going through? And why are people so angry? And how do they explain why people don't like what they're selling through their outlets anymore? And why are people so outraged at the way that they cover elections, etc.? And rather than engage in self-reflection and improve the I guess we'll call it the product that they would be offering us, they would rather use easy explanations so that you can just say Putin is interfering in the election or Russia is responsible, and without giving any substance or fact, that becomes an easy narrative for people to grab onto.
Right, and I want to expand on that as well, because Gallup polls show that distrust in corporate media has hit an all-time high. About 60% of the American population actually doesn't even trust the corporate media anymore. Do you think part of this attack on alternative media is also just another, it's a David versus Goliath scenario, old versus new media? What do you think about that?
I think that people who are running outlets like the Washington Post and the New York Times are very worried about the democratization of media and the way that people can now choose where they get their own information. It means that they have less control over us as consumers. And so if you look at this from a market-based standpoint, because after all, they're asking people to buy their news, they're not really peddling it as a public good. This is something that they need people to buy in order for them to continue. And for us, we still need people to, like Shadowproof, where I'm the managing editor, we need people to give donations. MintPress News needs donations to a certain extent. People still need to buy into us in order to keep us going. But I think there's this very real concern that with people going into their own, the way that they see it is people are going into their own bubbles and retreating into their own social circles and just creating these little narratives that they can live inside to explain their world that is completely detached from reality. And what they're doing is rather insulting, I think. I think it's a really backward way of handling what's going on. Because the reason this is happening is because the political class in this country hasn't addressed, and particularly the Democrats in this case, and I think for your audience and my audience, I'm more interested in focusing attention on Democrats, haven't explained why things are the way they are and addressed the material conditions that are being created, whether it's through globalization throughout the world or whether it's through the perpetual war on terror that's been ongoing that has had great impact on our civil liberties. And when you fail to connect dots and when you fail to give people meaningful understandings for why things are the way they are, then they start to retreat into their own little circles and try to explain it through conspiracy theories, through their own suppositions, their own interpretations. And we need real, I'm not patronizing people, but the word is probably leadership. We need people who have the ability to actually engage in real investigative journalism, to connect with people and give them something real so that they aren't just grabbing at these different fantasies and nightmares that they think exist in their lives.
Right, and I'm glad you talked about that, because we've obviously entered, Trump land as we speak. So why is independent media that's critical of establishment politics and politicians so important, especially now in a much more right-wing and post-Trump world?
We are going to be able to give people that alternative vision in order to show that this is what needs to happen next. I hesitate to say that I'm building news around an agenda, but I think that if you build an organization from an understanding of history, if you know the way that people have influenced history, the way that different social movements have created real change, and if you have that context and you bring it into coverage of current events as they are unfolding, then there's something very tangible that people can grab onto. And they don't have to just feel cynicism, and they don't have to just feel dejection after they see an outcome like the election of President Donald Trump, and that terrifies them. Well, if you can show them that there are people who actually have the capacity to engage in resistance and fight back, and that we actually can win victories even in dark times, then maybe you're not going to see people turn to violence. Maybe you're not going to see people turn to despair. Maybe you can find ways to channel people's energy into something positive. But I mean, there's no definitive guarantee that this actually works. It's just part of your organization actually being better. And I think, the final thing I would say in this answer here is that we do have to worry about fact checking our work. I do think that that's something that is important. I do think that we have to not fall into the same traps that CNN falls into when it wants to be the first outlet to get the click, when it wants to be the first outlet to get shared on Twitter and get the most response. You have to be very sure about what you're publishing, and that will always be true for every single media outlet in our news economy.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin Gosztola, managing editor at Shadowproof.com. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Mnar.